In this video I'm going to be giving you 7 really useful tips for using on the chop saw, mitre saw, and in this case it's a sliding mitre saw, but the tips apply to all 3 types, and in this particular case it's the R255 sliding mitre saw from Evolution Power Tools UK. A lovely saw, but the tips apply to any saw that you're using, whether it's a high-end one or a budget saw. Doesn't make any difference. They're all useful tips and it can be applied to any of them. So let's get on with it. The first tip: ear protection. This is not a noisy machine by any means. I don't know what decibels it is compared with other machines. It doesn't actually make any difference, because whatever the decibels are, they're not quiet machines. Wear ear protection, and there's always a chance that you're going to hit a knot and it's going to fly up, or anything, or a nail or whatever. Wear a pair of safety glasses. It's just common sense. The second part of this tip, we've got some little hand marks here, and that's just to tell you, keep your hands away from the blade. If you're using the left hand side, this is what we tend to do in the UK. I don't know why it is a thing, but in the UK we tend to use this side of the machine to support the wood and cut. I seem to have noticed in America they seem to put the wood on the other side and make the cut. Either way, keep your hands well out of the way of the blade. Also, when you bring the blade down, nice and slow. I've seen somebody giving tips, and they come with a blade and they start it up and whack it down straight through the wood like this is some kind of race. It isn't a race. Do it slowly and you'll not come to any harm. Tip number 2, make yourself a stop block. We've got a piece of wood here, 6 inches, and we're going to make it 3 inches, 6 inches by 3 inches. Now, another thing with the stop block, let's put it at 45. We'll put it that way, it'll be easier for you to see it. And we're just going to take the corner off. Okay, now if we're doing repeat cuts, we can set, say we want to do 5-inch pieces, we can put the wood against the fence at 5 inches, get one of these little clamps. They're quite handy, these, they're really quick to use. Clamp the piece of wood against the fence, and then when we get our piece of timber, put it against the fence, run it up against the stop block, make the cut. Now you notice I stopped the machine and left the blade right down at the bottom. When it's tight up against the stop block, the teeth, if you lift it up, they can catch on the piece and lift it up, and it can jam in, which is not good, because A, it'll move the stop block, but there's always a chance of something coming back at you. So you can just do repeat cuts and they'll all be exactly the same. size. Really handy. Okay, the reason for the little angle on the bottom, if it wasn't there, if it just square down and we clamp it in place, when you've done a couple of cuts, quite often you'll finish up with some sawdust laying around. Now, when you bring your piece of wood up, if you're not looking, you'll get the sawdust trapped behind it, and you finish up with that little gap there, and you're cutting away, you're not looking, and you're cutting them all short. Even if you try and clear it away a bit, it can still leave stuff there because it packs in. Now, with the angle on it, clamp it in place, get a little bit of sawdust. Even though we've got some sawdust there, we bring our piece of wood up, the sawdust goes into that space. It's not going against the wood, so the piece of timber goes nice and tight up against your stop block, and it's not a problem. Do keep clearing it away, because eventually it'll build up to such a point that it'll block anyway. But it just stops it being such a problem. Okay, the next tip: what if we want to cut some pieces that are longer than the fence? Say we wanted to cut them at 16 inches. We can't fit a stop block on there because it'd have to be over here. So the way around that is to get a longer piece of timber. Pick a nice straight piece if you can. Now, nearly all mitre saws, sliding mitre saws, have these holes in the fence. Now, if we come round the back, we can get some short screws, put them through the holes into our timber. So put the timber up against the fence, screw into it. There's a couple of holes at each side. Make sure that the screws don't protrude through the front. Now we've got a nice solid fence. First thing we need to do is to saw through it. And now, if we want that 16-inch piece, we can put our tape measure in there. We can mark off where our 16 inches is. We've got our stop block here, but it's a little bit awkward holding it on there and clamping it up and everything. So we'll make a slight modification to it. So we've got the offcut that we had. We'll use that, and we'll put that on top of there, like that, and pop. And basically all that's doing is making it easier to hold in place. So, get a little bit closer. Hopefully you can see there that we'll put that stop block against the line, get our clamp, clamp it in position, find our piece of timber. Now we can run it up against the stop block, make the cut, and we've got a 16-inch piece bob on. So the next tip is going to be a zero clearance plate. Now the reason that we have this is that the throat here on most machines it's quite wide, because if you put it over at a 45-degree bevel each way, it's got to allow for the blade to come across, which takes up more room. So they can't just leave a narrow gap because the blade would cut into it. So if you're only doing a 90-degree cut and you're doing, I'll give you an example. If we're cutting a small piece off here, just doing a little sliver, didn't happen that time, try again. Quite often what can happen is the piece falls down there and gets stuck. In fact, I've already got a few pieces in there, see, and it just gets full of these little pieces, and after a while they become a real nuisance. So what we need is to reduce the gap. As I say, if you're doing a 45 bevel, either way that's no good. But if you're just doing a lot of cross cutting, then it's ideal. So what we need is a piece of plywood. You don't want it too thick, because you're reducing the amount of depth that you're going to be able to cut. I wouldn't go any thicker than that, perhaps even a bit thinner would be better. And then you want a piece at the back. Now I would even suggest putting if we had it that way around, putting a chamfer on that bottom edge as well, so that that when you put pieces up against it, you're not trapping those shavings again. In fact, I'll go and do that and we'll come back. Okay, hopefully you can see there, I've just taken a chamfer off that edge, and that is going to go that way, so if there's any dust knocking about when you put the piece up against it, those shavings will go under that edge and allow you to put the piece hard up against the back. Just gives you a little bit of clearance there. So with that done, what we need to do is turn it over and put some screws in. One thing that we just got to be careful about is that we don't want any screws where the blade's going to be. So where the middle of the board is, we want to keep the screws clear of that, and then put 2 at each side. Make sure that the screw heads don't protrude out of the wood. Turn it over. Now, we just make sure we know where the screws are. We've got a centre line there. We know we're away from the screws at that point. So now we can put a saw cut through that. Now, ideally, we can clamp it in place, stop it moving around. Now we can still use the stop block idea, we can fix the stop block to there, but one of the other good things about this is it does reduce tear out. You see here we've got a bit of tear out on the bottom and on the back, and when we've got the zero clearance fence, it greatly reduces the tear out. It doesn't get rid of it altogether, but it does get rid of it a lot. And also we can do those little slivers without anything going down underneath there. Handy little thing. Also, it's a great way of lining up your cut as well. So if we mark on here 5 inches, put a mark at 5 inches. If we line that pencil mark up with that side of that cut, we know that's where the blade's going to go. So we make that cut and it'll be absolutely bob on. Handy thing to have. The next tip is a small piece holder. Now, say we want to cut this, or cut a small piece off it, or cut it in half or whatever. What I don't want to be doing is getting my fingers that close to the blade. It's just not good practice. So if I want to cut this, what I'd do is I'd use this. It's a little gadget I've made. It's got a block of wood on one end just to keep it off, keep it high. On the underside of the other end, I've stuck a piece of sandpaper. That's not necessary, but it's what I just cut 2 equal pieces and just staggered them so that it'd take that block. And what you're doing is you're holding that piece from back here, well out of the way, so you can position your piece, get that well out of the way, press down with your hand, nice and safe, and you can make the cut. And there's no danger there at all. Your hand's well out of the way, you've made a nice cut, and it's all nice and safe. And also, it's a good idea to use it with the zero clearance jig, because quite often, I'll show you, at the back there's got to be a fair gap there so that the blade doesn't hit this fence. Now if you were cutting a very small piece like this, what can happen is the piece can roll into the gap and jam up. So the zero clearance fence keeps everything nice and safe. There's no way it's going to. Much safer that way, especially with small pieces like this. The next tip is a dowel holder. If you've got a piece of thin dowel in, something like that, it can be really difficult to hold on to. You've got to sort of push it into the side and make the cut, and quite often when it starts cutting it could spin and it's just a little bit awkward. So made one of these. It's about 9 inches long. Doesn't matter about the length, it could be a bit longer, probably not shorter, but it could be longer. And it's got a V cut in it. I've cut that on the table saw, and it's a little more acute an angle than 45. So I set my blade on the table saw at 30 for each cut. So you set the saw over at 30, run it through, flip the piece around, run it through again, and you finish up with that. Now what you do with that is you can sit the piece of dowel in there. It's got it nice and snug. Put it up against the fence. You can bring, in fact you can even, what you could do just for extra little bit of safety, you bring that down, rest it against the blade, and you can put a clamp on it. Get my fingers to work. Put a clamp on it, and then feed your piece of dowel through, and all you're doing is holding it down into the bottom of the V, and now you can make your cut. Nice and safe. It's really secure, and you get a nice clean cut as well, because it does prevent a bit of tear out on the back of the dowel. So yeah, if I want to take another little piece out, there, nice and easy, handy thing to have. The next tip is what we call a sneak up cut, and if you made a cut on a piece of wood and it's just 1/2 mil too long, and you want to reduce it, it's a bit tricky just to gauge that little bit. Quite often you finish up cutting 1 mil off instead of half, but what you can do, because the teeth on the blade are wider than the blade itself, you can bring those teeth below the piece of wood. You can put the piece of wood up against the blade, and then start your machine up, and then come up and do the cut on the upstroke. And that just takes a fraction of a millimetre off. Now the other method is to put it down there against the blade and just push against the blade slightly. It will distort the blade slightly, and you can see there now the blade sat on top, but it's only 1/2 millimetre. So then you can make your cut. And you've cut 1/2 millimetre. So the first method, probably better if you just want to take tiny amount off. The second method, if you want to take a little bit more off. And after you've done it a few times, you get a feel for just how much you can press against the blade, and just take that 1/2 mil off. Well, I hope you found these tips useful. I use them all the time, and they are really useful. I've been using the Evolution R255 sliding mitre saw. As I say, it works on any mitre saw and chop saws, and yeah, this is a good bit of kit. And if you do fancy getting a mitre saw, there's a link in the description, and if you use the promo code of Cornish, CORNISH, you can get a 5% discount. So there you go. Keep those ear protectors. You don't have to get expensive ones. Any ear protection is better than none, but most of them up to a safety standard, and if you keep a pair on the saw, it just reminds you to use them. So anyway, my name's Andy Paramore, this is Andy's Cornish Creations, and be safe, and I'll see you on the next one. Goodbye.